A child's heart sees beauty where adults can only see differences. The morning sun was shining over the small town of Cedar Springs as Thomas McCarty adjusted his hat over his head and watched his daughter Emily play in the backyard. At the age of 42, Thomas carried in his calloused hands the marks of someone who knew well the hard work of the land. Widowed for 3 years, he raised Emily alone, and the 7-year-old had become his only reason to continue. The city was slowly waking up on that September morning. The dry wind carried the aroma of sage and dust, mingling with the familiar sounds of horses' hooves on the main street and the morning chatter among the merchants. Thomas was preparing for another day at the hardware store when Emily ran up to him, her golden hair hanging in the wind. "Daddy, can I go with you to the city today?" she asked, holding the rag doll that never let go. Thomas smiled. Emily was always curious about the world beyond her small home. He was a smart child, with blue eyes that seemed to see more than they should for someone so young. Since they lost Sarah, his wife, Emily had matured prematurely, but still maintained that pure innocence that made him believe that all was not lost in the world. "Of course you can, little one, but do you promise that you will stay close to me?" Emily waved excitedly and ran into the house to get the coat. Thomas watched her, feeling that familiar tightness in his chest. The girl resembled Sarah so much in her gestures, in the way she tilted her head when she thought, in the sweet smile that lit up any room. The walk to the city took about 20 minutes. Emily hopped next to her father, pointing to the birds that flew high, asking questions about everything she saw. Thomas responded patiently, grateful for those simple moments that made life bearable. When they reached the main street, the movement was already intense. Farmers arrived for the week's shopping, women chatted at the doors of the stores, children ran among the carts. It was an ordinary day in Cedar Springs, but Thomas didn't imagine that in a few hours his life and Emily's would take a completely different turn. The hardware store was downtown, between Joe Peterson's barbershop and Mrs. Martha's fabric store. Thomas opened the doors and lit the lantern, preparing to receive the first customers. Emily sat in her favorite corner, where there was a small chair and a low table where she drew while her father worked. Around noon, when the sun was already beating mercilessly over the dusty streets, a different buzz took over the city. Thomas looked up from his inventory when he heard the excited voices outside. Through the window, you can see a small group of people gathered near the church. "I wonder what's going on, Dad?" Emily asked, moving closer to the window. Thomas closed the account book and walked to the door. Curiosity was natural in small towns, where any novelty spread like fire in dry grass. He held Emily's hand, and together they walked towards the small group of onlookers. It was then that he saw her for the first time. She stepped out of the carriage with delicate movements, wearing a simple light blue dress that contrasted with her sun-tanned skin. But that was not what caught the attention of the people around. It was her hair, completely white, smooth and long, as if it had been touched by the moon itself. She couldn't have been more than 25, but that silver hair made her look like an apparition, something that didn't belong in that ordinary world of Cedar Springs. The man who accompanied her was known to all, Richard Dalton, the most prosperous farmer in the region. Rich, respected, but also known for his arrogance. He helped the girl out of the carriage with a proud smile on her face, as if showing off a trophy she had won. "Guys, I want to introduce you to Eleanor Whitmore," Richard announced loudly. "My future wife." A murmur ran through the group. Thomas can hear fragments of the surrounding conversations. Some women whispered about the girl's unusual appearance. Others commented on the age difference between the two. Richard was almost 50. Elena looked much younger. Elena kept her eyes down, her hands clasped in front of her body. There was something about his posture that conveyed fragility and, at the same time, a quiet dignity. Thomas felt a tightness in his stomach, a strange sensation he couldn't explain. That's when Emily let go of her hand and took a few steps in the direction of the couple. "I like her hair, Daddy," Emily said loud enough for several people to hear. "It's beautiful, like the hair of the angels in the church drawings." The silence that followed was deafening. All heads turned to Emily, who kept looking at Elena with genuine admiration. Richard Dalton frowned, clearly annoyed by the interruption. Some people laughed softly, others looked embarrassed. But Elena looked up for the first time since she had stepped out of the carriage. His eyes were a deep green, like the calm waters of a mountain lake. She looked directly at Emily, and for the first time smiled. Thomas felt his face burn with embarrassment. Quickly, he walked over to Emily and put his hand on her shoulder, trying to push her away. But Elena had moved a few steps closer, ignoring Richard Dalton's disapproving look. Elena leaned slightly toward Emily, her green eyes shining with genuine gratitude. The child smiled even more, completely oblivious to the tension that hung in the air. Emily rarely talked about Sarah in public, but something about Elena had sparked her natural confidence. Thomas muttered an apology and tried to lead his daughter back to the store, but Richard Dalton stepped forward. The farmer addressed Thomas in a voice charged with calculated coldness, suggesting that it would be appropriate to teach the child when to speak and when to remain silent. The silence deepened. Thomas felt anger rise up his chest, but before he could respond, Eleanor lightly touched Richard's arm. His intervention was soft but firm, defending the child's innocence. Richard looked at Elena with an expression that Thomas couldn't fully decipher, but there was something there that bothered him. Control, possession, the kind of glance a man casts on something he considers his property. Richard forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes, superficially agreeing with Elena about the children's innocence, but his voice carried a tone of barely concealed warning. The crowd began to disperse, but Thomas noticed that some people were still watching, whispering among themselves. He knew that kind of behavior well. In small towns, news quickly turned into gossip, and gossip could become much worse. Thomas held Emily's hand tightly, announcing that they needed to go back to the store, but Emily resisted for a moment, looking once more at Eleanor with childlike curiosity about whether the girl would stay in town. Elena hesitated before confirming that yes, she would make Cedar Springs her new home. Emily expressed joy at the possibility of a new friendship, but Richard interrupted with a harsh laugh, explaining that Elena would soon be a married woman with important responsibilities. With no time to make friends with children, Thomas felt the comment as a blow. There was something about the way Richard spoke that irritated him deeply. He tilted his hat slightly toward Elena, ignored Richard completely, and led Emily back to the store. For the rest of the afternoon, Thomas tried to concentrate on his work, but his mind kept coming back to that scene. There was something about Elena that disturbed him, and it wasn't just her unusual appearance. It was the way she had looked at Emily, with a genuine kindness that contrasted sharply with Richard's controlling demeanor. Emily, on the other hand, kept commenting on Elena, asking why people had looked at her in that strange way. Thomas tried to explain that people were sometimes curious about different things, but that this did not justify such behavior. Emily's next remark surprised him. The girl had noticed that Elena looked sad, even when she smiled. Emily has always had an impressive ability to read people's emotions, an inheritance from Sarah, who also possessed this natural intuition. Thomas suggested that Elena might just be nervous about being in a new place, though she knew the explanation wasn't enough. Around 5 in the afternoon, as Thomas was closing the store, Joe Peterson showed up at the door. The barber was a middle-aged man with a grey beard and a natural tendency toward gossip. Joe immediately began to comment on Elena, describing her story as strange and questioning the motives of such a young woman marrying a man of Richard's age. Thomas continued organizing the tools, trying to show disinterest. Joe persisted, reporting rumors that Richard had met Elena in San Francisco, a young woman with no family and nowhere to go. The barber considered the situation too convenient to be a coincidence. Thomas replied curtly that it was none of his business, but Joe continued. The man insisted that Elena was different in a disturbing way, speculating about the naturalness of her hair and commenting on something strange in her eyes. Thomas's patience ran out. He closed the drawer with unnecessary force and suggested that if Joe had nothing to buy, he would like to close the store. The barber got the message, but not before warning that a man should be careful who allowed his daughter to approach. After Joe left, Thomas stood in the doorway of the store, watching the street begin to clear as the day drew to a close. The barber's words echoed in her mind, blending with the image of Elena and Emily's innocent comment. Emily appeared next to him, holding the doll, and asked a question that touched Thomas's heart. She wanted to know why Richard hadn't liked it when she complimented Elena's hair. Thomas knelt next to his daughter, explaining that sometimes when people were different, other people were uncomfortable. It wasn't right, but it happened. Emily questioned whether different meant bad, and Thomas was emphatic in denying it. Emily nodded, pleased with the answer. But Thomas remained there, kneeling, looking into his daughter's blue eyes and thinking of Elena Whitmore. There was something about that situation that bothered him deeply, a feeling that he was witnessing the beginning of something that would not end well. That night, after putting Emily to sleep, Thomas went out onto the porch of his small house and looked toward Richard Dalton's farm, which was a few miles from town. Some light still shone on the windows of the big house. He wondered if Elena was okay, if he had anyone to talk to, if anyone had bothered to ask if she really wanted to be there. The night wind brought the distant sound of a howling coyote on the prairie. Thomas closed his eyes and tried to push away the thoughts that were troubling him. But the image of Eleanor, with her sad green eyes and silver hair, remained there, etched in her mind like a mark that would not come off easily. The following days brought subtle but noticeable changes to Cedar Springs. Elena began to appear in the city, accompanied by Richard, always walking a few steps behind him, her eyes downcast, her hands clasped in front of her body. There was something about his posture that reminded Thomas of a bird with clipped wings, still handsome, but unable to fly. Thomas watched from afar, pretending to be busy with work in the shop, but his eyes inevitably searched for Elena whenever she appeared on the main street. She wore simple dresses, always in the most neutral colors, as if trying to go unnoticed. But that silver hair made any attempt at invisibility impossible. Emily noticed too. The girl had developed a habit of standing at the window of the store whenever she heard the sound of Richard's carriage approaching. She watched Elena with the silent fascination of a child who recognizes something special, even without fully understanding what he sees. In the 3rd week since Elena's arrival, Thomas witnessed a scene that deeply disturbed him. He was carrying sacks of grain for Mrs. Henderson when he saw Elena standing in front of the fabric store. She held a piece of delicate lace up to the light, examining the details with her fingers. For a moment, his face lit up with something that felt like genuine joy. Richard appeared next to her as a sudden shadow. His words were too low for Thomas to hear, but the effect was immediate. Elena dropped the lace as if she had burned her fingers, lowered her head, and walked away from the window. Richard put his hand on her back, a gesture that seemed gentle from a distance, but Thomas noticed how Elena stiffened at the touch. That night, Thomas found Emily drawing at the kitchen table. It was a simple drawing, made with the colored pencils Sarah had bought before she died. A woman with long white hair, wearing a blue dress, was holding hands with a small girl. Both smiled. Thomas sat next to his daughter, studying drawing. Emily had captured something in Elena that he himself had felt but couldn't name. A natural gentleness, an ability to connect that transcended the strange circumstances of his arrival in the city. The following week brought the Fall Festival, an annual tradition that brought together all the families of Cedar Springs and the surrounding ranches. Thomas had normally avoided social events since Sarah's death, but Emily had begged to go, and he didn't have the heart to deny it. The festival took place in the central square, with food stalls, games for children, and live music. Thomas remained on the outskirts, watching Emily play with other children while he chatted politely with some acquaintances. That's when he saw Eleanor again. She was sitting alone on a bench near the church, watching the festivities from a distance. Richard was engaged in a lively conversation with other farmers near the bandstand, apparently oblivious to his fiancée. Elena wore a dark green dress that highlighted her eyes, but her posture remained the same, small, withdrawn, as if she wanted to disappear. Thomas watched for several minutes. No one approached Elena. The women of the town completely ignored her, some casting furtive glances in her direction before returning to their conversations. The men pretended not to see her, but Thomas noticed how some of them watched her when they thought no one was paying attention. It was Emily who broke Elena's involuntary isolation. The girl had grown tired of the games and ran to where Thomas was, but stopped suddenly when she saw Elena. Without hesitation, Emily walked over to the bench and sat down next to the woman. Thomas felt his stomach tighten, remembering Joe Peterson's words about being careful who he let his daughter approach. But when he saw Eleanor's face light up with Emily's presence, Thomas felt something loosen in his chest. Elena leaned slightly toward the girl, and though Thomas could not hear what they were saying, he could see the expression of genuine joy that came over Elena's face. Emily showed Elena something, probably one of the small toys she had won in the games, and Elena examined the object with real interest, not feigned. She pointed to something in the distance, and Emily followed her gaze, laughing at something only the two of them understood. The scene lasted only a few minutes, but it was long enough for others to notice. Thomas saw some women whispering, pointing discreetly at Elena and Emily. He also saw when Richard finally realized where his fiancée was, and began to walk towards them with quick and determined steps. Thomas didn't think twice. He crossed the square and reached the bank before Richard. Emily looked at him with her eyes shining with excitement. Elena, on the other hand, seemed to cringe even more, as if expecting a reprimand. But Thomas simply held out his hand to Emily, indicating that it was time for them to go home. When Richard finally arrived, Thomas and Emily were already drifting away. Thomas heard Richard's low but harsh voice behind him, and when he turned quickly, he saw Eleanor standing beside the farmer, her head bowed, her hands shaking slightly. That night, Emily couldn't stop talking about Eleanor. The girl had discovered that Elena knew about birds, that she could identify different species by singing, that she knew stories about distant places. To Emily, Elena had become an almost magical figure, someone who brought knowledge and kindness to her small world. Thomas listened to everything in silence, but his own observations worried him. He had seen the fear in Elena's eyes as Richard approached. He had seen how she shrunk, how her hands trembled. He had also seen the way Richard looked at him and Emily, a look that carried both warning and threat. 3 days after the festival, Thomas was closing the shop when he saw Eleanor walking alone down the main street. It was unusual to see her without Richard, and Thomas immediately noticed that something was different. She limped slightly, favoring her right leg, and kept her left arm close to her body as if protecting something. As she passed in front of the store, Thomas could see a dark purple near her left wrist, partially hidden by the sleeve of her dress. Elena didn't look in her direction, but Thomas saw silent tears running down her face. At that moment, Thomas McCarty made a decision that would change the course of everything that would follow. He locked the shop, took Emily by the hand, and followed Elena at a distance, keeping himself far enough away not to be noticed, but close enough to make sure she would arrive safely at her destination. What he discovered that afternoon disturbed him more than anything he had witnessed in his 42 years of life. Thomas followed Eleanor to a safe distance, Emily at his side asking questions that he gently ignored. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the buildings, and the wind carried the familiar scent of sage and dry earth. Elena walked slowly, clearly in pain, occasionally stopping to rest against a wall or pole. She didn't go to Richard's farm, as Thomas had hoped. Instead, he headed to the small church at the end of the main street, a simple wooden building with a stripped cross on top. Thomas watched her enter, and after hesitating for a few moments, decided to go with Emily. The interior of the church was empty and silent, illuminated only by the golden light that filtered through the simple windows. Elena was kneeling on the first bench, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. Her silver hair fell like a curtain around her face, partially hiding the tears that Thomas knew were there. Emily let go of her father's hand and walked down the central aisle with silent steps. Thomas felt the urge to stop her, but something stopped him. The girl approached Elena, and with the natural delicacy of sensitive children, reached out her small hand and gently touched the woman's shoulder. Elena lifted her face, her green eyes shining with fresh tears. When he saw Emily, an expression of surprise and relief took over his features. The girl climbed onto the bench next to Elena and, without saying a word, offered her rag doll, the same one she had been carrying since Sarah had died. Elena accepted the doll with trembling hands, holding it to her chest as if it were the most precious object in the world. In that moment, Thomas saw something that touched him deeply. Two wounded souls finding comfort in each other. A child who had lost his mother, and a woman who seemed to have lost everything else. Thomas approached slowly, footsteps echoing softly in the sacred space. Elena saw him and immediately tried to get up, wiping her face with the back of her hand, but Thomas gestured for her to remain seated. In that moment of shared silence, Thomas made a decision that he knew would change everything. He had spent 3 years living in isolation from his own grief, protecting Emily and himself from the outside world. But seeing Elena there, seeing the natural connection between her and her daughter, she understood that some situations required courage beyond personal comfort. Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas began creating opportunities for chance encounters. When he saw Elena in the city, always accompanied and always with that withdrawn posture, he found ways to be around. Not out of romantic interest, his loyalty to Sarah remained intact, but out of a sense of protection he couldn't ignore. Emily became his natural accomplice in this mission. The girl had developed a keen instinct to spot Elena in the crowd, and always found excuses to get closer. Thomas noticed that Richard began to pay more attention to these interactions, his eyes narrowing whenever he saw Emily near his fiancée. The situation came to a head one November morning, when the cold had arrived early in Cedar Springs. Thomas was opening the store when he heard screams coming from the direction of the boarding house where Eleanor and Richard were temporarily staying. Richard's voice echoed down the morning street, charged with anger and accusations. Thomas left Emily with Mrs. Martha and walked in the direction of the screams. When he got close to the boarding house, he could hear fragments of the discussion. Richard accused Elena of inappropriate behavior, of giving wrong hope to people who did not understand their place in society. The silence that followed was more disturbing than the screams. Thomas waited around the corner, pretending to examine a wagon, until he saw Elena leave the boarding house. She walked even slower than usual, and Thomas noticed new, troubling signs in her appearance. That afternoon, Elena did not show up in town, not even the next day. Richard was seen in the shops, conducting business with his usual arrogance, but always alone. When asked about Elena by some onlookers, he vaguely replied that she wasn't feeling well. On the third day, Thomas made a decision that he knew could have serious consequences. He left Emily with Mrs. Martha once more and rode to Richard Dalton's farm. The property was about 3 miles from town, an impressive expanse of farmland surrounded by a large 2-story house. Thomas had been there before to deliver tools, and he had always been greeted with the self-interested warmth typical of Richard. This time, it was different. Richard left the house before Thomas even dismounted, his face charged with suspicion and irritation. He questioned what Thomas wanted, his voice carrying a coldness that had not been present in previous encounters. Thomas made up an excuse about a special request for tools Richard had made, but they both knew it was a pretext. Richard didn't invite him in, leading the conversation in the front yard, as if Thomas were an unwanted peddler. It was during this tense conversation that Thomas saw Elena. She appeared briefly in one of the second-floor windows, only for a few seconds, but long enough for Thomas to see what he needed to see. Her face was marked by bruises that she couldn't completely hide, and she moved with the caution of someone who had suffered recent injuries. Richard followed Thomas's gaze, and when he realized what he had seen, his expression hardened even more. He informed Thomas that Elena was unwell, nothing that could not be resolved with proper rest and care. But his voice carried a clear warning. Thomas was not welcome there, and his concerns were neither needed nor wanted. Thomas left the farm with a heavy heart and a bubbling mind. He had confirmed his worst suspicions, but he felt powerless to do anything about it. In Cedar Springs, Richard Dalton was a respected and influential man. Thomas was just a widowed merchant with a young daughter. That night, he found Emily sitting on the porch, looking in the direction of Richard's farm. The girl had noticed Elena's absence and asked questions that Thomas didn't know how to answer. Emily broke the silence with a remark that pierced Thomas's heart. She said she felt Elena was sad and alone and asked if there wasn't something they could do to help her. Thomas looked at his daughter, this brave girl who saw goodness where adults saw only differences, who offered friendship where others offered judgment, and knew he couldn't just stand still. The next morning, Thomas McCarty began to formulate a plan that would test all the limits of his courage and forever change the fate of 3 lives intertwined by chance and compassion. The sun was rising over Cedar Springs, painting the sky golden and red, when Thomas finally made the decision he had been avoiding. Some battles, he understood, were too big to be fought alone, but some causes were too important to be abandoned. Elena needed to know that she was not alone, and Emily needed to learn that sometimes doing what's right takes more courage than doing what's safe. The story that had begun with an innocent comment about silver hair was about to reach its defining moment, where the kindness of a child would inspire the courage of a man, and together they would find out if compassion could triumph over cruelty in a world that does not always reward the kind. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the exciting ending of this story that shows how courage is born from compassion.